Because I Could Not Stop for Death by Emily Dickinson. Because I could not stop for death, he kindly stopped for me. The carriage held but just ourselves, in immortality. We slowly drove, he knew no haste. And I had put away my labor and my leisure too, for his civility. We passed the school, where children strove, at recess in the ring. We passed the fields of grazing grain. We passed the setting sun. Or rather, he passed us. The dews grew quivering and chill, for only gossamer my gown, my tippet only told. We paused before a house that seemed a swelling of the ground. The roof was scarcely visible, the corniche but a mound. Since then, 'tis centuries, and yet each feels shorter than the day. I first surmised the horses' heads were toward eternity. Alright. In this poem, Emily Dickinson utilizes several different rhetorical devices. So what we're going to do is just go line by line, stanza by stanza, and analyze some of those. Because I could not stop for death. That's the first line of the poem. And obviously Emily Dickinson wanted to leave quite the impression with her first few words. Just with the very first word, because, just leading out a sentence with because. Emily Dickinson doesn't do that for no reason. She obviously has a reason behind that. She's basically assuming that there's going to be a question within the poem. It's telling the reader that something is going to be answered, something is going to be explained. And I could not stop for death. That's basically the speaker saying that she had no choice but to die. Like she had no control over what was going on for her. If you want to look a little bit further into that first line, death is actually capitalized, making it proper noun. And as a proper noun, obviously death becomes something. It's not just death as we think of it. It's actually becoming like a human, possibly. He kindly stopped for me is the second line of the poem. And that further personifies death, as in the first sentence, or the first line of the poem. She has it capitalized, and then it just officially makes it a personification. Makes death obviously a man, because of he. The carriage held but just ourselves. This whole line really establishes a tone for the poem. It establishes a tone of really calm acceptance for what's happening here. I mean, somebody who's going to die or knows that they're going to die may not feel as at ease as the speaker in this poem. The carriage held but just ourselves and immortality. And immortality is its own line in this stanza. And that is basically assuming that not that her life is going to carry on forever as we think of it, but that her afterlife will carry on forever for eternity, and that's going to be her immortality, just living on forever in like her spirit form. We slowly drove, but he knew no haste. This is pretty simple, that death really took its time. It wasn't rushing, it just slowly came about her, and it took her slowly. And I had put away my labor and my leisure too for his civility. These three final lines of the first stanza kind of speak on how the speaker has gone about her death. She's basically given up on her regular life, her work, her playtime, and she's given it up all for him, all for death, and actually in that last sentence, or the last line, she says, for his civility. So basically she's given it all up just because death has been so good to her. It's been so calm. It's something that she's really accepted fully. In the second stanza, the first line goes, we passed a school where children strove. And the next line, at recess in the ring. This line establishes a little bit of a more eerie tone to the poem, starting at that second stanza. And it's also saying that death is just like an everyday thing. It's representing death as something normal, just like children playing at recess at school. It's just basically saying that it's no big deal for her, and that she's moving through it just like she would any other thing. We passed the fields of gazing grain. we pass the setting sun. In that first line, we pass the fields of gazing grain. Grain is actually personified to be gazing and watching her as she passes. And we pass the setting sun. So basically, once again, she's just moving in Death's carriage. She's just moving through her afterlife. Or rather, he passed us. So this is just saying that this is referring to the sun as he, personifying the sun. And it's basically saying that the sun just left her. So the sun set before she could have a chance to pass it. So basically, she took her time. She was going really slowly with Death. And that actually comes back all the way to the first stanza, last line, for his civility. It's basically saying Death didn't rush her, really. Since then, 'tis centuries, and yet each feels shorter than the day. So, we just realized in this last stanza that this happened a long time ago. This lady did not just die, it's just a really vivid memory for her death. And since then, 'tis centuries, so it's been, obviously, centuries since she's died. And yet each feels shorter than the day. So she's basically saying that this is like, feels like it just happened to her. Feels like she just died. At first surmised the horses' heads were toward eternity. That's one of the most powerful last two lines of the poem. She's basically just saying that she is in eternity. And when she first saw the horses' heads of the carriage, she may not have recognized them for what they were. But once she did realize it, she knew that they were toward eternity and her afterlife, and she accepted them as they were. So basically, the poem starts out with a pretty calm tone, very calm, very accepting of her death, moves toward a little bit more eerie, and then just settles back where she started with the really calm, accepting tone. How have you grown as a learner throughout the course? I've grown quite well. I would like to think that I grew quite a bit as a learner throughout having you as a teacher, not only in this year, but junior and senior year. I feel like I've learned to accept more opinions. I've learned to think a little bit further outside of the box than I usually did. In my previous English classes, I would just sit there in my own little bubble, my own desk, and analyze like poems or other literature, and I would just absorb my own thoughts and learn to accept those as fact, in my opinion. And then, like, through your course, I realized that working with others and trying to see, I didn't necessarily agree with other people's ideas or their opinions about certain works. However, I could see where they were coming from. And by seeing their opinions and seeing how they came to that conclusion, I learned so much. I realized a lot more about literature. I realized that there are, like, I used to think that sometimes people would dive too deep. I still do consider that some people go way too deep into the meaning of work. However, I learned a whole new definition of literature. I mean, to be easiest explanation, I went from 2D to 3D understanding of literature and writing as a whole. What is the most important idea or argument that was generated in discussions, and can you explain this concept in your own words? One of my absolute favorite discussions and arguments that we had in our class was actually pretty recent. We were speaking about intentions versus actions. And I always held the belief that intentions meant nothing unless they were turned into action. And I still hold that belief. However, I did hear some great arguments from other students in the class that made me think twice about it. And the more that I thought about it, the more I held to my opinion, and I actually came up with more solid, how can I put it? I came up with a more solid opinion, more solid reasoning to back my opinion. And I'm completely grateful for some of the students in the class for giving me what I consider weaknesses in their arguments, just to use them for my own strength, and it really helped me learn a lot. Alright, why is this the most important concept, and how does it apply to your world as a whole? I definitely consider this the most important concept that we ever went over in class, just because it really solidifies the idea And some people do really think that if they intend to do something good, then it means that they did good. And that's just not something you can ever live by. You have to work, you have to make your thoughts and your talk, you have to walk that. It's a classic saying, if you want to talk the talk, you got to walk the walk. And it's completely true. I couldn't agree more. How do you think this issue is viewed by those with whom you disagree? Well, with those people who disagree with my opinion on this, it seems to be a general consensus that they feel like as long as you had the intention to do something, then you're a good enough person to at least consider it. And just by considering it, you're good. You're in the clear. And I definitely do not agree with that. It doesn't matter how much you intend to do something. If it doesn't happen, then you weren't good enough to do it, obviously. And if you weren't good enough to do it, what's the point of thinking about it? How can or will you use what you learned in this course outside the four walls of our classroom? Well, actually just what I was talking about with the intentions and actions. Just going over that in class for a couple of days and speaking and arguing about that really made me realize that I'm not taking some actions that I probably should be. Like something as simple as registering for my classes in college. I wasn't even thinking about it. However, I had the intention in the back of my head every day. I had the intention of going home and jumping online and getting that all set up. But I just never did. And the day that we actually had that conversation, I wrote it down in my notebook, so when I got home and cracked it open, I would immediately see that and get right on it. And that's something, like, I'll always carry that with me, remembering to hold my intentions at bay and just act, do what I need to do, and get everything done.